weight checks before every flight, fired at 32, fired for getting married, fired for wearing glasses, fired for being pregnant, and the most staggering part of all, women were lining up around the block to get the job. Welcome. Dim those lights. Pull your blanket a little higher. Settle into whatever position your body has been quietly negotiating for the last few minutes. Because tonight, we are not going to a castle. We are not going to a dungeon. We're going somewhere stranger in some ways. Somewhere that smells of jet fuel and Chanel No. 5, where the carpeting is a precise shade of burnt orange, where every woman on board is under 32 years old, unmarried, and has been weighed within the last 48 hours. Tonight, we are going to 35,000 feet, and we're going somewhere that 1960s America considered the most glamorous workplace on Earth. Take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy drifting off to mildly outrageous, deeply factual history. And if you feel like dropping a comment, where are you watching from? What time is it? I always love knowing who is on the other side of this. Now get comfortable, because the questions tonight are strange ones. What exactly did the airlines have against married women? Why was 32 considered too old to hand someone a glass of orange juice? Who was actually running the weigh-ins? And what happened if you failed one? What did the women themselves think about all of this? And did any of them fight back? What did it feel like to be at the absolute glamorous peak of American working womanhood? And know your employment contract had an expiration date attached to your left hand the moment a man put a ring on it. And perhaps most puzzling of all, why did millions of young American women in the 1960s consider this the best job they could possibly hope for? Congratulations, you have just woken up in 1963. You're standing in a terminal at Idlewild Airport, the one that will eventually be renamed JFK, and the air smells of cigarette smoke, perfume, and the particular metallic cold of air conditioning working very hard against a New York summer. The carpet beneath your feet is slightly sticky. The ceilings are enormous, and walking past you in a line, with a precision that suggests they have all been to the same school to learn how to walk, are 6 young women in matching uniforms. Their skirts are fitted, their gloves are white, their hats are pinned at exactly the same angle. Their lipstick is the exact shade of red that American Airlines has selected this season for reasons that have been debated in a boardroom for longer than you might expect. They are smiling. They're all between the ages of 21 and 31. They're all unmarried. They're all within the last week confirmed to be between 110 and 135 pounds, depending on their height. And they are heading to a Boeing 707 bound for Los Angeles, where they will spend the next 5 hours serving drinks, managing turbulence, calming nervous passengers, and handling whatever the skies decide to throw at them, all while appearing entirely unruffled. They are called stewardesses, and in 1963 there is no more aspirational job in America for a young woman who wants to see the world. If you enjoy listening to sleepy history stories like this one, subscribe. I post stories like this every week. What you're about to learn tonight is the full, strange, quietly enraging, and occasionally darkly funny story of what it actually meant to hold that job. The rules they lived under, the weigh-ins and the marriage bans and the age limits and the girdle checks and the rules about earrings and the rules about nail polish and the rules about whether you could wear your hair below your collar. The women who loved it anyway. The women who quietly seethed, and the women who eventually decided they had had enough and changed everything. But first, let the terminal settle around you. Let the noise of the 60s fade just slightly. The clatter of the departure boards, the distant whine of jet engines, the murmur of travellers. Let the carpet hold you. Let the air, a little cool, a little stale, fill your lungs. We are going back, all the way back to where this began. To understand why the stewardess became what she became, you have to understand what flying was before she existed. And what flying was before she existed was, bluntly, terrifying. Not terrifying in the cinematic sense, not lightning and screaming and oxygen masks. Terrifying in a quieter, more persistent way. The terror of the unfamiliar, the terror of the machine, the terror of trusting your body, your life, your fate to something that had only recently been invented and had, on multiple documented occasions, decided to stop working in mid-air. Aviation in the 1920s was young and honest about its dangers. The pilots were mostly former military men who had come home from the First World War with skills that had no peacetime application and a deeply relaxed attitude toward personal safety. The aircraft were small and loud and cold and prone to mechanical failure at the worst possible moments. The routes were short, the seats were few, And the passengers, the very small number of passengers who actually climbed aboard, were a very specific type of person. They were businessmen mostly. Men who had somewhere to be and needed to be there faster than a train could take them. Men who had calculated with the cool arithmetic of commerce that the risk of an experimental aircraft was worth the saving of several hours. They wore suits. They brought briefcases. They sat in their wicker seats. Early aircraft cabins had wicker seats, which tells you something about how provisional the whole enterprise felt. And they gripped the armrests and they looked out the small windows at the ground, becoming very distant beneath them. And they tried to look like they were fine. Most of them were not fine. The noise alone was extraordinary. Early aircraft engines were not engineered with the comfort of passengers in mind. The propellers created a roar that made conversation impossible and reading difficult and sleep essentially out of the question. The cabins were unpressurized, which meant that at altitude the air was thin and cold, and the passengers sometimes arrived at their destinations with headaches and a dazed quality that they attributed to the excitement of the journey rather than mild oxygen deprivation. The seats were not padded in any meaningful way. The turbulence, without the weather prediction technology that would come later, was unforecasted and therefore always surprising. And underneath all of it, running beneath every minute of every flight was the knowledge, never quite articulated, never quite admitted, that this was a machine that human beings had invented approximately 20 years ago, and that the full implications of that invention had not yet been worked out. The airlines understood this. The airlines understood that their single largest problem was not mechanical. It was psychological. They could improve their aircraft. They could hire better pilots. They could plot safer routes. But they could not, through any of these improvements, shake the fundamental unease that their passengers felt the moment they stepped aboard. What they needed was something, or someone, who could make the experience feel safe, feel normal, feel like something other than an act of organized insanity. They needed a presence. A reassuring, authoritative, calm presence who could move through a terrified aircraft cabin and, through sheer competence and composure, communicate to everyone aboard that this was all perfectly fine. In 1930, a registered nurse from Iowa named Ellen Church wrote a letter to Boeing Air Transport suggesting that she be hired to work aboard their aircraft. Not as a pilot. She had her pilot's license, but that was not what she was proposing. She was proposing something new. She wanted to be a cabin attendant. She wanted to be the person who took care of the passengers. She wanted to bring her nursing skills, her calm under pressure, her ability to manage frightened and uncomfortable people, her medical training, into the air. Boeing Air Transport hired her, and then hired 7 more nurses, and in May of 1930, on a flight from San Francisco to Chicago, Ellen Church became the first stewardess in history. The effect was immediate and almost startling in its success. Passengers calmed down, complaints dropped, repeat bookings increased. The mere presence of a young woman in a uniform moving confidently through the cabin, handing out chewing gum to help with ear pressure and offering blankets and checking on the gentleman in row 4 who had been looking slightly green since Cleveland. This alone was enough to make the whole enterprise feel less like a dare and more like a service. The airlines had found their solution, and they began, slowly and then very rapidly, to replicate it. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because Ellen Church was a nurse, she was hired for her medical training, her professional competence, her ability to manage a medical emergency at altitude. The earliest stewardesses were all registered nurses, and the requirement was genuine. These were women who could handle a passenger having a heart attack, or a child with a severe ear infection, or a man going into shock over the mountains of Colorado. That lasted approximately 4 years. By the mid-1930s, as aviation expanded and the number of flights multiplied, and the demand for cabin staff grew faster than nursing schools could supply, the airlines began to quietly drop the nursing requirement. They kept the uniform. They kept the calm demeanour. They kept the idea of a young woman who would take care of you in the air, but they let go of the actual medical competence and replaced it with something else. What they replaced it with was a specific vision of femininity, a particular fantasy of the ideal woman, nurturing, patient, cheerful, decorative, young, unmarried, and perpetually available to help. The stewardess, by the end of the 1930s, had been transformed from a medical professional into something altogether more complicated. She was still described in terms of care and competence, but the selection criteria had shifted in ways that told a different story. The height requirements appeared, the weight requirements appeared, the age cutoffs appeared, the marital status rules appeared, And beneath all of these specific regulations was a broader and less explicitly stated requirement. The stewardess had to be desirable. Not sexually available, not exactly, though the marketing would occasionally dance very close to that implication. But visually pleasing, reassuring in an aesthetic sense. The kind of woman whose presence communicated not just competence, but a particular kind of mid-century femininity that passengers, and the airline executives who were, almost entirely men, found appealing. This transformation did not happen all at once. It happened gradually, across a decade and a half, as different airlines competed with each other, not just on routes and prices and aircraft technology, but on the quality and appearance of their cabin staff. United, American, TWA, Pan American. Each one developed its own regulations, its own uniform, its own vision of the ideal stewardess. And while the specifics varied, the general direction of travel was consistent. The stewardess was getting younger, getting lighter, getting more regulated, getting further with each passing year, from the nursing school of Ellen Church and closer to something that resembled, if you looked at it honestly, a beauty pageant with wings. By the time the 1950s arrived, the rules governing stewardess employment had grown into something remarkable. Not remarkable in a good way. Remarkable in the way that a set of regulations can be remarkable when you read them carefully and realize slowly what they actually imply about the people who wrote them. Let us go through them. Let us go through them slowly, because they deserve to be examined slowly. Let the details settle into you the way warmth settles into a cold room, gradually, thoroughly, reaching the corners last. The height requirement. Most airlines required stewardesses to be between 5 feet 2 inches and 5 feet 8 inches. The official justification was practical. The galley equipment was designed for a certain height range. The overhead compartments required a certain reach. This was plausible. It was also almost certainly incomplete. The weight requirement. This was the one that attracted the most attention, and for good reason. Airlines set specific weight ranges based on height, and they enforced them. Not loosely, not as a general guideline, but with actual weigh-ins, regularly scheduled, sometimes quarterly, sometimes before individual flights. The numbers varied by airline, but the general expectation was a maximum weight that, by today's standards, would place most of the required stewardesses in a category that nutritionists would describe as underweight. The age requirement. This is perhaps the one that seems strangest to a modern eye. Most airlines required stewardesses to be no older than 32, and some were stricter than that, with mandatory retirement at 30. The justification offered was that the job was physically demanding, that older women could not handle the rigours of the schedule. This explanation has the particular quality of explanations that are technically possible, but obviously incomplete. Plenty of 33-year-old women were physically capable of carrying a drinks trolley. The actual answer lay elsewhere. The marriage ban. This was the rule that would eventually become the centre of a legal battle that helped reshape American labour law. From the earliest days of commercial aviation through into the 1970s, in some cases the 1980s, most major American airlines would automatically terminate a stewardess who got married. Not might terminate, would terminate, on the day it was discovered or shortly after. The rationale given was that married women would eventually become pregnant and distracted and less attentive to their duties. The rationale not given, but present in every board meeting where this was discussed, was something else entirely. Something about the image. Something about what a married woman communicated versus what an unmarried woman communicated. Something about the fantasy of availability that the airlines were selling, whether or not they used those exact words. And then there were the smaller rules. The rules that, taken individually, seem like corporate dress code policies, but taken together describe something more comprehensive. The rules about makeup. How much? Which colours? Applied how? The rules about nail polish. Approved shades only, and the shades were selected seasonally. The rules about hair, above the collar, or pinned, or within a precise maximum length. The rules about jewellery. Small earrings only, no dangling. The rules about girdles. Yes, girdles. Some airlines required them. Some airlines had supervisors who checked. The rules about perfume, approved scents only. The rules about shoes, heel height specified to the inch. Each of these rules, read in isolation, sounds like ordinary corporate policy. A company has a dress code. This is normal. But the accumulation of them, the sheer density of regulation applied to a single category of employee, The specificity of control over their bodies and their personal lives and their romantic choices and their weight and their age and their marital status. The accumulation tells a different story than any individual rule. The story it tells is about power, about who has it and who does not, about what it means to exist in a workplace not primarily as a professional, but primarily as an image, about the peculiar position of the 1960s stewardess, who was simultaneously celebrated as a symbol of modern womanhood and controlled in ways that would make a Victorian governess raise an eyebrow. Let the night settle a little heavier around you as you think about that. Let the sound of jet engines, distant and low, hum somewhere beneath your awareness. The carpet of the terminal is soft. The lights are dim. Outside, through the enormous windows, an aircraft is taxiing toward the runway, its navigation lights blinking red and white in the dark. Somewhere aboard it, a young woman in a fitted uniform is checking that the overhead bins are secured. She's 24 years old. She has been weighed this week. She's not married. She has 3 more years before she ages out of the job she has spent 2 years training for. She's smiling. She is good at smiling. We are going to stay with her for a while. You're sitting in a waiting room in Chicago. The year is 1965. The chairs are orange plastic, bolted to the floor in a row, and there are 43 other young women sitting in chairs exactly like yours, in a row exactly like yours, waiting for exactly the same thing. You have applied to be a stewardess for United Airlines. You have filled out a form that asked your age, your height, your weight, your marital status, your vision quality, your language abilities, and your hobbies. You have submitted a photograph, full length, which the form specified, along with a letter explaining why you wish to fly. You have been invited from a pool of several thousand applicants to attend an interview. The room smells of cigarette smoke and anxiety and a dozen different perfumes, which collectively create something that is not quite any of them individually. The women around you are well dressed in the precise way that requires effort to look effortless. Their hair is done. Their makeup is done. They are sitting with the particular posture of people who are aware that the interview may already have begun. It has already begun. The selection process for stewardesses in the 1960s was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The airlines received applications in the tens of thousands annually. American Airlines, at its peak in the mid-60s, was reportedly receiving 5,000 applications for every 100 positions. The ratio meant that the selection process could afford to be, and was, exceptionally rigorous. And the criteria it used to sort those thousands of applicants into the chosen 100 were a fascinating mixture of the professional and the personal, the rational and the purely aesthetic. The professional requirements were straightforward enough. A high school diploma was mandatory. Some airlines required 2 years of college. Customer service experience was valued. Working in retail, in restaurants, in hotels, in any context that required managing the needs of strangers with consistent cheerfulness. Language skills were increasingly prized as international routes expanded, and a stewardess who spoke French or Spanish or German had a genuine advantage. First aid training was required, and some airlines still maintained a preference for nurses, though the hard requirement had long since been dropped. These were the parts of the application that looked like any other professional job, the parts that assessed in a recognizable way whether the candidate had the skills and background to do the work. And then there were the other parts. The height and weight requirements were not merely stated in the job listing, they were verified at the interview in person, not by asking the candidate to confirm the numbers she had written on the form, by actually measuring and weighing her. In the 1960s, it was entirely standard for an airline interview to include a moment where the candidate stood against a measuring tape on the wall and stepped onto a scale, with a representative of the airline recording the results. If the numbers did not fall within the specified range, the interview ended, politely, with the suggestion that perhaps she might reapply when her situation had changed, as if her height was something that might change if she tried harder. The weight checks were the ones that generated the most varied responses among the women who went through them. Some found them humiliating, some found them entirely normal, because they had grown up in a culture that weighed women's worth alongside their weight, and this was simply that culture made explicit. Some found them motivating in a way that, in retrospect, looks less like health consciousness and more like the early stages of disordered eating. The specific numbers varied by airline, but the general picture was consistent. The maximum weight for a stewardess at 5 feet 5 inches was typically around 130 pounds, which today would place that woman comfortably below the healthy weight range for that height. The airlines did not use the phrase unhealthy. They used words like trim and neat and well-proportioned. The language was always aesthetic. The language was always about appearance. Because the weight requirement was about appearance, and everyone involved understood that, even if the official explanation was always something about the practicalities of a narrow aircraft galley. The vision requirements were strict. Most airlines required perfect or near-perfect uncorrected vision. Glasses were prohibited. Contact lenses were technically allowed but subject to individual assessment. The official reason given was safety. In the event of an emergency, a stewardess needed to be able to see clearly. The unofficial reason, which was never explicitly stated but was present in every decision about the visual standards, was that glasses were considered unflattering, and an unflattering stewardess was a stewardess who did not fit the image. The interview itself, once the physical assessments had been completed, was unlike most job interviews in one very specific way. In most professional interviews, the interviewer is attempting to assess the candidate's competence and qualifications. In a stewardess interview in 1963, the interviewer was doing that, and also assessing the candidate's personality in terms that had more in common with a social audition than a professional evaluation. They were looking for warmth, but a specific regulated kind of warmth. Not the warmth of a woman who says exactly what she thinks, who disagrees when she disagrees, who is funny in a way that is sometimes at someone else's expense. The warmth of a woman who can sustain a smile through provocation, who can be pleasant to a difficult passenger, who can manage her own discomfort and fatigue and frustration without ever allowing any of it to surface. The warmth, in short, of a woman who can perform equanimity on demand. They would test this in the interview with questions that were sometimes directly rude. How do you handle a passenger who is rude to you? What would you do if a passenger made an inappropriate comment? How would you respond if a male passenger grabbed your hand? The correct answers were always some variation of cheerful, patient deflection. The candidate who said she would report the inappropriate passenger was viewed less favourably than the candidate who said she would handle it with a smile and a gentle redirect. The training schools, and the airlines each had their own, some of them lasting 6 to 8 weeks, continued this process of professional formation. The stewardesses learned the technical requirements of their job: emergency procedures, first aid, galley management, the mechanics of the specific aircraft they would be flying. These were genuine skills, genuinely taught, genuinely important. A stewardess who could not manage an emergency evacuation or administer first aid to a passenger in cardiac distress was a liability, and the airlines knew it. But alongside the technical training ran the other curriculum. The curriculum about appearance and demeanour and presentation. The sessions on makeup application, taught by representatives from the cosmetics companies that the airlines contracted with, because the makeup requirements were specific enough to require formal instruction. The sessions on posture. The sessions on how to move through a narrow aisle efficiently and gracefully simultaneously. The sessions on how to handle a passenger who was drunk, or frightened, or flirtatious, or all three at once. And the weigh-ins. The training schools had weigh-ins too, weekly or monthly, depending on the airline. A trainee who gained weight during training could be asked to leave. The weight was tracked throughout, a running record of numbers that was part of the trainee's file, and that she was always aware of, in the way you are always aware of a number that determines your right to remain somewhere. The graduation from training school was, by all accounts, genuinely celebratory. The women who made it through, who had survived the physical assessments and the training curriculum and the ongoing weight monitoring and the personality evaluations, felt, reasonably, that they had accomplished something real. They had. The dropout rate from stewardess training programs was significant. Getting through was not automatic. Getting through required stamina and professionalism and resilience and a specific kind of discipline. They graduated in their new uniforms. They received their wings. They were photographed, usually in groups, a row of young women in matching outfits, all smiling the regulated smile, all representing the image that the airline had spent considerable resources constructing. And then they went to work. The first months of flying were, by most accounts, extraordinary. The combination of the novelty and the travel and the camaraderie, because the stewardesses who flew together developed a fierce, specific solidarity. The solidarity of people who share an unusual experience and an unusual set of constraints created something that felt genuinely like freedom. Freedom of a constrained kind. Freedom within very specific limits, but freedom nonetheless. You were 22 years old and you were flying to Paris. You were 23 and you were landing in Tokyo for the first time. You were 24 and you had been to more countries than most of the passengers on your flights, and the man in seat 12A who was so confident about his importance could not have said the same. The job gave the women who held it something that most women of their generation could not access: the world. A direct, physical, tangible encounter with the world beyond the town or city where they had grown up, beyond the husband and the house and the domestic structure that was the default trajectory available to women in 1963. This is the part that the rules and the weight checks and the marriage bans cannot fully obscure. The women who became stewardesses were not simply victims of an unfair system, though they were that too. They were also, genuinely, people who had chosen an extraordinary life within an unfair system, who had found within the constraints something real, something worth having. The sadness is not that they had the job. The sadness is what happened the moment someone put a ring on their finger. Let the hum of the aircraft settle around you now. Let it vibrate, very gently, through the seat, through the floor. Outside the window, the ground is very far below, a dark patchwork of city lights and roads, and the occasional blue-white flicker of a swimming pool. The air at 35,000 feet is minus 60 degrees outside the metal skin of this aircraft, and you would last approximately 30 seconds in it. But inside it is warm, and the carpet is that burnt orange that seems to have been the universal choice of 1960s aviation interior designers. And someone has just placed a small bag of salted peanuts on your tray table. The woman who placed it there is 25. She is smiling. She has been smiling since before you got on. She will keep smiling until after you get off. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quiet and persistent, is the knowledge that she is 7 years from 32. She is very good at not thinking about it. The rule book in some airlines was an actual book, a physical document issued to each stewardess upon completion of training, that specified in precise detail the requirements of her professional appearance and personal conduct. Not a pamphlet, not a handout, a book. Reading it now, and copies of these documents have survived, have been archived, have been quoted in memoirs and legal depositions and congressional testimony, is one of those historical experiences that produces a very particular feeling. The feeling is not quite anger, though anger is in there. It is more like the feeling of reading something that is written in the language of the ordinary, but describes the extraordinary. The language of corporate policy applied to the territory of a person's body and choices in daily life. Let us read it together, slowly, with the attention it deserves. The makeup requirements first, because they are the most elaborate. The stewardess was required to wear makeup on every flight. Not permitted to wear makeup, required to. A stewardess who boarded an aircraft without lipstick was in violation of her employment conditions. The lipstick had to be a colour approved by the airline. The approved colours were different for different airlines, and the colours changed seasonally, and each season's approved palette was distributed to the stewardesses on a small card that many of them kept in their uniform pocket, alongside their emergency procedure card. The foundation had to match the stewardess's skin tone within an acceptable range. The range was specified, and too pale was a violation as much as too dark. Eye makeup was permitted within limits. Mascara, yes. Heavy eyeshadow, no. Eyeliner subject to the discretion of the supervisor. Blush was permitted but specified, a natural flush rather than a theatrical contour. The hair requirements were similarly specific. Hair had to be worn up, or pinned back, or at a length that kept it above the collar. The reasons given were practical. Loose hair in a galley environment creates hygiene concerns, a reasonable point that most food service workers would recognise, but the specific regulations went beyond hygiene into aesthetic territory, with a precision that suggested the latter was doing at least as much work as the former. Certain hairstyles were prohibited, not because they were impractical, but because they were considered too casual, or too severe, or somehow inconsistent with the image the airline wished to project. The colour had to be natural, not explicitly specified in all cases, but sufficiently implied that the stewardesses understood it. In the 1960s, an obviously dyed hair colour on a stewardess was a supervisory conversation waiting to happen. The uniform itself was, of course, specified in the most exhaustive detail. This is not unusual in any professional context. Airlines give all their employees uniforms. This is normal. It is a branding exercise as well as a practical one. What made the stewardess uniform different was the degree of specification that went beyond the garment itself. The uniform could be worn in exactly one way. The jacket buttoned from the bottom up, not the top down. The blouse collar turned out over the jacket lapel, not tucked inside. The skirt hemline had to fall at a specific point relative to the knee. not above a certain measurement, not below a certain measurement, and the measurement was checked, not trusted, checked, underneath the uniform, the girdle requirement. This is the one that, when you encounter it in historical documents, produces a kind of double take. But it is real. Several major airlines, the specific ones are documented in depositions from legal proceedings in the 1970s, required their stewardesses to wear a girdle while in uniform, not as a suggestion, as a condition of employment. The official reason given, when it was acknowledged at all, was that it contributed to the smooth line of the uniform skirt. The actual reason, which everyone involved understood, was about the appearance of the body beneath the uniform, about the airline's insistence on controlling not just what the stewardess wore but what her body looked like through what she wore. Some airlines employed supervisors whose specific responsibility included checking compliance with these requirements. These supervisors, sometimes called appearance supervisors, sometimes given other titles, would conduct reviews before flights, checking makeup, checking hair, checking the hang of the uniform, checking in some documented cases that the stewardess was wearing the required undergarments. The women who went through these checks described them in varying ways. Some found them entirely routine. This was the job, these were the standards, you knew them going in. Some found them humiliating in a way they could not quite articulate at the time, though they could articulate it very clearly 30 years later in an interview or a memoir. Some found them a source of pride. The standards were high, and meeting them consistently was a form of professional competence, a demonstration that you could do what the job required, even when what the job required was uncomfortable. All three responses were reasonable. All three responses were also, in different ways, a form of adaptation to something that should not have been required of anyone. The weight monitoring deserves its own examination, because it operated at a level of detail that distinguished it from ordinary corporate wellness policies. The quarterly weigh-ins, or the more frequent weigh-ins at some airlines, or the random check-in weigh-ins that could happen at any time, were conducted formally with the results recorded. A stewardess who exceeded her weight limit by 5 pounds received a warning. A stewardess who exceeded it by 10 pounds might be placed on a weight management program. A stewardess who could not bring her weight back within the specified range within a given period could be suspended. A stewardess who remained out of compliance could be terminated. The weight limit itself was, by modern nutritional standards, unhealthy for most women at most heights. A stewardess who was 5 feet 6 inches tall was typically required to weigh between 120 and 138 pounds. The exact numbers varied by airline but were consistently within this range. The lower end of this range, for that height, corresponds to a body mass index of approximately 19, which is technically within the normal range but at its very lowest edge, and which, for a woman with a larger natural frame, would require a degree of caloric restriction that most doctors today would consider inadvisable. The women who went through the weight monitoring described a culture around eating and weight that, described in contemporary terms, sounds strikingly like the environment that produces eating disorders. Not because the airlines intended to produce eating disorders, they didn't, and there is no evidence that they thought carefully about the health implications of their requirements at all, but because the constant measurement, the concrete consequences of gaining weight, the professional identity tied to a number on a scale, these are conditions under which disordered eating reliably develops, and they developed. Former stewardesses, speaking to researchers and journalists in the 1980s and 90s, when retrospective conversations began to be possible, described strategies they had used to manage their weight under the quarterly weigh-ins. Crash dieting in the week before a scheduled check, fasting on the day of the weigh-in, wearing the lightest possible clothing, in one documented case, removing as much jewellery and clothing as decorum allowed, while still technically remaining dressed. The strategies were creative and practical and deeply sad, because they were the strategies of women who had been put in a position where their body was a workplace metric. The marriage ban was, in some ways, simpler than the weight requirements. It was simpler because it was absolute. There was no warning, no management program, no period of compliance monitoring. If a stewardess got married, she was required to disclose it. If she disclosed it, she was terminated. If she failed to disclose it and the marriage was discovered, through a colleague mentioning it, or a supervisor noticing a ring, or the not uncommon case of another passenger or employee recognizing the stewardess as someone who had recently gotten married, she could be terminated for the concealment as well as the marriage. The logic offered by the airlines, when they bothered to offer logic, was that marriage would lead to pregnancy, and pregnancy would lead to a need for leave, and a need for leave would disrupt the scheduling that the airline's operations depended upon. This logic was never rigorously examined, because if it had been rigorously examined, it would have immediately raised the question of why male employees who got married, and thus also potentially had access to parenthood, were not subject to the same termination requirement. A question that was never satisfactorily answered, because the satisfactory answer was not available in the language that mid-century corporate America was willing to use about itself. The age requirement was perhaps the most illuminating in its way, because the number itself was so specific. 32, not 40, not 50, 32. This is an unusual age at which to declare a person too old for a job that involves carrying a tray and managing an emergency evacuation. Most 32-year-old women are in excellent physical condition. Most 32-year-old women with 2 years of college and several years of professional experience in customer service and first aid and aircraft operations are at or near the peak of their professional competence. But 32 was, in the 1960s, the age at which most middle-class American women were expected to be well settled into the domestic phase of their lives, married, with children, or expecting them. Past the age at which the culture insisted their primary physical attractiveness was in its prime. 32 was the cutoff, not because 32-year-old women couldn't do the job. It was the cutoff because 32-year-old women didn't look the way the airlines had decided stewardesses were supposed to look. There is a specific poignancy to the testimonies of women who were forced out at 32 or 30, or whatever age the airline they worked for had selected. These were women who were, by any objective measure, at the height of their professional capabilities. They had spent years developing expertise in their field. They knew the routes, the aircraft, the procedures, the passenger management techniques that could only be learned through experience. They were better at their jobs than they had ever been when they were 22, and new and trying to remember which button operated the galley refrigeration. And they were shown the door because of a number that had nothing to do with what they could do and everything to do with what they looked like. The aircraft continues its patient passage through the dark. Below somewhere, cities are going about their nighttime business. Somewhere a kitchen light is on, and someone is having a glass of water at 2 a.m. because they couldn't sleep. Somewhere a dog is dreaming, its paws moving slightly, chasing something through an inner landscape. Somewhere a child is breathing the slow, unconscious breath of the very deeply asleep. On this aircraft, in the galley, a young woman is washing cups. She is 26. She has been flying for 3 years. She is good at this, genuinely good, in ways that go beyond following the procedures, good in the way that some people are just naturally suited to a kind of work that require a combination of physical endurance and emotional regulation, and quick problem-solving and deep patience that is relatively rare and genuinely valuable. She has 6 years left. She's not thinking about that right now. She's thinking about which passengers will want coffee, and which will want to sleep, and whether the man in row 8 is going to be a problem again tonight, and whether she remembered to restock the first aid kit after the turbulence over Denver. She's not thinking about the number, but the number is there, quiet in the background, the way numbers are when you have been told very clearly what they mean. Here is a magazine advertisement from 1971. It is a real advertisement for a real airline that ran in major American publications and won an advertising industry award. The headline reads, "I'm Cheryl, fly me." Take a moment with that. Let it settle in. The advertisement showed a young woman in a flight attendant's uniform. She was looking at the camera with an expression that the advertising copywriters had presumably described as inviting. The airline in question was National Airlines. The campaign, which became nationally famous and nationally controversial almost simultaneously, was part of a broader advertising phenomenon of the late 1960s and early 1970s, in which the stewardess had become, explicitly and without much euphemism, the central marketing tool of the American aviation industry. The airlines had discovered something, had known it in softer form since the 1930s, but had fully embraced it by the 1960s, which was that the stewardess sold tickets in a way that routes and prices and aircraft technology could not. She was the human face of the airline. She was the reason, according to market research that the airlines commissioned and took seriously, that a significant proportion of male business travellers chose one carrier over another. Not the food, not the legroom, not the on-time performance, her. The stewardess had become, by the mid-60s, the subject of a marketing campaign of extraordinary reach and consistency. Across the major carriers, across the advertising agencies that competed for aviation accounts, across the magazines and billboards and television commercials that constituted the media landscape of the era, a single image was being constructed and maintained and promoted: the stewardess as the ideal woman. Young, beautiful, capable, available, yours for the duration of the flight. The word available is doing complicated work there. It was never made explicit in the way that would have made the advertisements obviously obscene. The suggestion was always plausibly deniable. She was available to bring you a drink, available to help you with your seatbelt, available to make your journey comfortable. But the visual language of the advertisements, and the verbal language of the slogans, and the whole context of an industry that was requiring its female employees to be unmarried and young and weighed before every flight, all of this communicated something additional, something that operated below the level of the explicit. Continental Airlines ran a campaign with the line, "We really move our tail for you." The visual was a stewardess. American Airlines for a period ran advertisements that described their stewardesses as the girls we hired to please you. TWA developed elaborate promotional materials, films, brochures, advertisements, in which the stewardess was styled as a fantasy companion for the male business traveller. Pan American, which served the most glamorous international routes and therefore had the most aspirational brand, developed a stewardess image of such specifically constructed perfection that it became, for a significant portion of the American public, the standard against which all service was measured. The airline marketing departments and the advertising agencies worked together to construct the stewardess image with a precision that, from a purely professional standpoint, was impressive. They researched what male passengers responded to. They tested different visual presentations. They developed specific stewardess types. The warm maternal type for passengers who wanted to feel taken care of. The bright professional type for passengers who wanted to feel served by competence. The glamorous sophisticated type for passengers who wanted to feel they were in rarefied company. These were not random aesthetics. They were researched and refined, and they corresponded to actual variations in how different airlines positioned themselves. And the stewardesses who flew these airlines were expected to embody these images. Not in a way that was spelled out in the rulebook. The rulebook spelled out the lipstick colour and the girdle requirement, not the emotional presentation required. But in a way that was understood, communicated through training, and through the culture of each airline's cabin crew, and through the specific feedback that supervisors gave to stewardesses, whose performance evaluations noted that their presentation or warmth or overall passenger appeal was not meeting expectations. Passenger appeal. That phrase was actually used in performance evaluations. The ability to appeal to passengers, which is a professional skill in any service industry, was in this context inflected with something that went beyond professional service quality. It was inflected with the specific chemistry of a young woman presenting herself to passengers in the way the airline had determined was most commercially effective. The impact of this marketing on the women who actually did the job was complex. Some of them found it helpful. The glamour image attracted respect occasionally from passengers who might otherwise have treated cabin crew as insignificant. Being a stewardess for Pan Am in 1965 carried a social status that was genuine and recognised, and that status made certain aspects of the job easier, even as other aspects of the construction of that status were oppressive. Some found it irrelevant. They were doing a job, doing it professionally, and the marketing materials were something they noticed at the beginning, and stopped noticing after a while. Some found it corrosive. The steady pressure of existing as an image rather than a person, of being evaluated by strangers according to criteria that had nothing to do with your competence, of knowing that the reasons the passengers were looking at you were not all professional. But the marketing had an effect that went beyond how it felt to the stewardesses themselves. It shaped how the passengers behaved. It gave male passengers a specific cultural framework within which to interpret the stewardess, a framework that made a certain kind of behaviour feel, to those passengers, like a reasonable response to a situation the airline had created. The touching, the comments, the invitations, the treating of the stewardess as a performance for the passenger's personal enjoyment rather than a professional, managing the safety and comfort of a pressurised tube at 35,000 feet. The stewardesses developed strategies for this, shared and passed down within the cabin crew community, the way professional knowledge always passes between experienced practitioners and newcomers. Specific deflection phrases for specific categories of unwanted attention. Techniques for removing a hand from your wrist in a way that did not escalate the situation. Strategies for managing the passenger who had consumed 5 drinks and was now interpreting the service relationship through a lens that the stewardess had not consented to be viewed through. These strategies were not in the rulebook. The rulebook told you how to wear your lipstick. the strategies for managing the human consequences of being marketed as an aspirational fantasy. Those were passed on in the galley, between flights, in the brief conversations during transit through airports where stewardesses recognized each other's uniforms and exchanged the specific look of professional solidarity. The look that said, "I know, I have dealt with that too. This is what works. This is what doesn't. You're going to be all right." The marketing machine ran alongside the rule machine, and together they created a situation of profound contradiction. The airlines needed the stewardesses to be professional, competent, safety-trained, emergency-capable. They needed women who could manage a cardiac event and evacuate an aircraft and maintain their composure during mechanical failure and turbulence. These are serious professional requirements, and the airlines took them seriously. At the same time, the airlines needed the stewardesses to be decorative, young, unmarried, weighed, and packaged as a consumer experience for the passengers who were paying for the tickets. These requirements were in tension with the professional ones, not theoretically in tension, but practically daily in every weigh-in and age-out and marriage termination. The tension was never resolved, because resolving it would have required the airlines to choose between the image and the profession, and they were not willing to make that choice. They wanted both. They wanted a woman who was simultaneously a fully trained aviation safety professional and a fantasy of accessible femininity, and they saw no contradiction in requiring both simultaneously because they had never been required to examine the assumption that both were possible. The women aboard the aircraft managed the contradiction by themselves, as they managed so much else. The night outside the window is very dark now, and very complete. The cabin lights have been dimmed for the passengers who are sleeping, and the only lights visible are the small reading lights of the few passengers still awake, making pools of gold in the general darkness. Someone has covered themselves completely with the thin airline blanket, including their head, so that their presence is indicated only by a slight rising and falling of the synthetic fabric. Somewhere in the back, a child has been asleep for 2 hours. In the galley, the lights are brighter, and there is the quiet sound of a cup being placed on a tray, and the sound of a page turning. The woman in the galley is 28. She is reading, in the 20 minutes between drink services, a novel that she has been reading for 3 weeks because the schedule does not give her long stretches of reading time. She reads quickly during the available minutes, her finger marking her place the moment she hears the first sound from the cabin that suggests she will be needed. She's very good at hearing those sounds. After several years, you learn the specific acoustics of an aircraft cabin in the dark. The years between 1958 and 1969 are sometimes referred to in aviation history as the golden age of commercial flight. The jet age had arrived. The Boeing 707 entered commercial service in 1958, making transcontinental and transatlantic travel not just possible, but fast, reliable, and increasingly accessible. The aircraft were new and impressive. The routes were expanding. The experience of flying had shed some of its earlier terror and retained most of its glamour, and for a brief window of approximately a decade, it occupied a genuinely special place in American cultural life. Flying was still, in 1960, relatively expensive. A round-trip ticket from New York to Los Angeles on a major carrier cost approximately $250, roughly $2,000 in current terms. This meant that the typical passenger on a domestic flight in 1960 was either a business traveller whose company was paying or someone for whom the ticket represented a significant personal expenditure, a marker of an occasion, not a routine commute, an event. The eventness of flying shaped the experience aboard the aircraft in ways that are difficult to fully imagine from the current context of budget airlines and middle seats, and paying extra for a checked bag. The food was real. Not excellent necessarily, but genuinely cooked, served on real plates, with actual cutlery, metal, because the TSA requirements that would eventually abolish metal implements from cabin service did not yet exist. The drink service was liberal, and in the era of the 3-martini lunch culture of American business, liberality with drinks was not merely tolerated but expected. The seats were larger. The legroom was substantial by any comparison with current aircraft configuration. And at the centre of all of this, the ambassador of the entire experience, the person whose professional demeanour set the tone for the flight, was the stewardess, in her fitted uniform, with her approved lipstick, at her approved weight, working a job that gave her the world and took from her, in ways she often could not fully articulate until decades later, something harder to name. The camaraderie among stewardesses during this period was real and is consistently described in memoirs and interviews and historical accounts as one of the defining features of the experience. The women who flew together developed bonds forged in the specific circumstances of spending hours in a pressurized metal tube with a small group of colleagues, managing whatever the flight presented and then sharing the strange hours in a hotel room in a city that was not home. The layovers, the nights spent in cities along the route, waiting for the return flight, were a significant part of the stewardess experience and a significant source of the freedom that made the job genuinely appealing despite its constraints. A layover in Paris, or Rome, or Tokyo, or San Francisco meant hours or sometimes days in a city with no professional obligations and frequently a group of colleagues who were equally interested in seeing whatever there was to see. The stewardesses who flew international routes in the 1960s travelled more and more independently than virtually any other professional demographic of women in America. They went to markets and museums and restaurants that they found themselves, without a tour guide, navigating the specific pleasures of independence in an unfamiliar city. They made friendships with people in those cities, people they might see again on the next layover, or might not see for years, or might never see again. They collected over years of flying a mental map of the world that was their own. Not the tourist map, not the business traveller's map, but the map of someone who had spent 3 hours in a specific neighbourhood market in Lisbon looking for a specific kind of cheese because a colleague had described it on a flight 2 months ago. This was the other stewardess experience, the one that existed alongside the weigh-ins and the marriage bans and the age cut-offs. It was real. It was documented. It was the reason that women kept applying and kept choosing the job and kept being, on the whole, committed to their work even as the conditions of that work were deeply unfair. The discontents, when they came from a specific generation of stewardesses who had grown up reading a wider range of literature and thinking a wider range of thoughts about what women's professional lives could and should look like. The generation who entered the workforce in the early 1960s were the first generation who had grown up with Simone de Beauvoir on one end of the cultural shelf and Betty Friedan beginning to write on the other. Not all of them had read either, but the arguments were in the air, the way arguments about significant things always exist in the cultural atmosphere before they become explicitly political. The discontents surfaced first in small ways, in conversations in the galley or in hotel rooms during layovers, or in the letters that stewardesses sent to each other, and they maintained correspondence. The stewardesses of the 60s, in the way that people who move around a great deal and have no fixed community maintain correspondence. Small observations about the unfairness of specific rules, specific irritations with specific supervisors, the beginning of a language for describing the experience that went beyond the official language of professional standards and started to sound, tentatively, like the language of rights. The marriage ban was the first rule to produce organised resistance, because it was the most obviously irrational in its application. The airline's position, that marriage rendered a woman unsuitable for employment, was a position that sat increasingly uneasily with a broader cultural and legal landscape that was, slowly, moving toward the recognition that women had rights in the workplace that employers could not simply override. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the key moment. Title VII of that act prohibited employment discrimination based on sex, among other categories. When the act passed, the stewardesses and their advocates looked at its language and then looked at the marriage ban and the age cut-offs and the weight requirements, and began to have conversations about what the law actually required of the airlines. The airlines, initially, were not interested in those conversations. The airlines' position was that their regulations were legitimate occupational requirements, that the image of their cabin crew was a business necessity, and that business necessity could justify regulations that might otherwise appear discriminatory. This was not an implausible legal position in 1965. The law was new. Its application to specific employment practices was untested, and the airlines had considerable resources available for legal arguments. But the stewardesses had something the airlines had not anticipated, or had perhaps underestimated: each other. The solidarity that had developed in galleys and hotel rooms over years of flying began to find organisational form. Stewardesses began to talk to each other not just about specific supervisors or specific incidents, but about the systematic nature of the rules they lived under. They began to identify the rules not as individual corporate policies, but as a coherent system, a system designed to maintain a particular kind of control over a particular category of worker. And slowly in the second half of the 1960s they began to fight back. Let the darkness outside the window be restful for a moment. Let the hum of the engines be the background to nothing in particular. Not a plot point, not a building tension, just the steady sound of a machine doing what it was built to do, reliable and undramatic in the dark. Below, somewhere, an ocean is going about its oceanic business, vast and indifferent to anything on the surface or above it. The water is very dark. It has been dark since long before this flight, and will be dark long after. The aircraft's passing leaves no trace on it. Above, the stars are the same stars that were there when the first aircraft took off from Kitty Hawk, and before that, when the first birds evolved flight in the Jurassic, and before that, for billions of years of patient burning. They are not watching. But if they were watching, they would see this. A small metal tube, bright with the warmth of sleeping people, crossing the dark at 580 miles per hour, carrying in it a woman who is reading a novel in a galley and thinking, between pages, about whether she's going to get married in the spring. She knows what getting married means for her employment. She knows exactly what it means. She has not decided yet. In 1972, a group of stewardesses based in the United States formed an organisation called Stewardesses for Women's Rights. The name was deliberately plain. It did not use the language of corporate policy or professional standards, or aviation industry best practices. It used the language of rights, women's rights, the rights of the specific category of professional woman who found herself subject to regulations that governed her weight and her marital status and her age in ways that her male colleagues were not subject to. The organisation was not the first attempt at organised resistance among stewardesses. The unions had been part of the picture for years. The Airline Stewards and Stewardesses Association had existed since 1945, providing collective bargaining on wages and scheduling. But the union, which also represented male cabin crew and which operated within the conventional framework of labour relations, had not made the specific gendered regulations, the weight checks, the marriage bans, the age cut-offs, its central focus. The union was about wages and hours. Stewardesses for Women's Rights was about something else. It was about the body, the rulebook, the system. The women who founded and led the organisation were a specific type of person, and the type is interesting because it is not who you might expect. They were not, for the most part, women who had found the job miserable from the beginning and were looking for an exit. Many of them were women who had genuinely loved the work, who were committed to it professionally, who had chosen to spend years of their lives doing it. They were resisting not because the job had failed them, but because they were good enough at their jobs to see clearly what the conditions of those jobs actually were. Sondra Jarvis, Kathleen Heenan, Jan Folsom. Names that did not become nationally famous but that appear, if you look for them in the historical record, in the legal documents and the newspaper coverage and the congressional testimony of the early 1970s. Women who showed up at hearings and gave careful, specific, documented testimony about what the regulations they lived under actually meant in practice. Not emotional appeals, specific accounts of specific requirements, accompanied by documentation. The documentation was significant, because the rules were written down in the rule books that had been issued to the stewardesses, and the documentation of those rules was the most powerful evidence available. It was difficult to argue that the weight requirements were not discriminatory when you had a document that specified, in writing, the maximum weight allowed for a woman of each height who wished to remain employed at a specific airline. The legal strategy built on the foundation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. The argument, developed carefully over the early 1970s, was that the regulations applied specifically and exclusively to female employees constituted sex discrimination under the law. The marriage ban terminated women who got married but not men. The age cut-offs applied to women but not to male cabin crew who flew in certain capacities. The weight requirements. There were no equivalent weight requirements for male employees in comparable roles. The airline's defence was the bona fide occupational qualification exception, the provision in Title VII that allowed employers to discriminate on the basis of sex, if sex was a genuine occupational requirement for the job. The airlines argued that the specific requirements they placed on stewardesses were genuine occupational requirements, that the passengers required a specific type of person in that role, and that the requirements were reasonably related to that passenger expectation. This argument, stated plainly, was essentially, our passengers prefer young, thin, unmarried women. Therefore, requiring our employees to be young, thin, and unmarried is a legitimate business practice. It is, when stated plainly, a remarkable argument. It is saying that customer preference for discrimination justifies the discrimination. It is saying that the fact that some passengers valued a stewardess for her appearance rather than her professional competence meant that requiring all stewardesses to maintain a particular appearance was a legal occupational requirement. The courts did not ultimately find this argument entirely convincing. The marriage ban was among the first to fall. In 1968, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued guidance finding that marriage bans on female employees constituted sex discrimination under Title VII. Not all airlines immediately complied. Compliance was a process and a contested one, and some airlines maintained the ban in various forms into the 1970s. But the legal foundation for the ban had been undermined, and the direction of travel was clear. The age cutoffs were addressed in litigation that moved through the courts over the late 60s and early 70s. The specific cases are documented in legal history. Weeks versus Southern Bell, Rosenfeld versus Southern Pacific, Diaz versus Pan American World Airways. Each case established precedents. Each case moved the interpretation of Title VII a little further in the direction that the stewardesses had been arguing for. Diaz versus Pan American is particularly notable. Celio Diaz applied to work as a cabin attendant at Pan American World Airways in 1967 and was rejected, not because he lacked the qualifications, but because Pan Am did not hire men for cabin crew positions. Pan Am's defense was essentially the same as the defense used for the stewardess regulations, that passengers preferred female cabin crew, and therefore female-only hiring was a legitimate business practice. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in 1971 rejected this argument. The court held that customer preference did not constitute a bona fide occupational qualification. The mere fact that passengers might prefer female cabin crew did not mean that being female was a genuine job requirement. The job requirements were safety, competence, customer service, and those requirements could be met by people of any sex. The decision was significant not only for what it meant for male cabin crew, which was, eventually, that they had to be hired, but for what it meant for the argument about female cabin crew. If customer preference for female attendants did not justify excluding men, then customer preference for a particular kind of female attendant, young, unmarried, thin, also struggled to justify excluding women who did not fit that preference. The weight requirements lasted the longest. They were the most difficult to dislodge legally because they could be framed as safety or health requirements in ways that the marriage ban and the age cutoffs could not. The airlines maintained weight requirements in various forms into the 1980s and, for some carriers, into the 1990s. It was not until 1991, in a class action settlement with United Airlines, that the weight requirements for flight attendants were substantially modified, and even that settlement did not eliminate them entirely. The woman who became the most visible face of the fight against the weight requirements was a stewardess named Cheryl Stewart. Stewart, who flew for United Airlines in the 1980s, challenged the weight requirements through the union and through legal proceedings, drawing public attention to the specific numbers and the specific consequences. The coverage she generated is worth reading, not for the drama of it, because the drama of legal proceedings is usually more procedural than cinematic, but for the specific testimony, the documentation of what the weight requirements meant in practice for the women who flew under them. Meanwhile, the organisation of stewardesses that had been developing since the early 1970s was finding connections it had not expected. The women's movement, which had been building since the early 60s, and which had reached a significant moment of public visibility in 1970 with the Women's Strike for Equality, had always included working women's concerns within its broader frame. But the stewardess situation had a particular vividness to it. It was specific and documented and involved rules that were, in writing, applied only to women and only to their bodies and only to their personal lives. It was, in other words, the kind of case that made abstract principles concrete. The principles about women's right to equal treatment in the workplace became very specific when the rulebook was in front of you. The journalists who covered the stewardess situation in the early 70s were not all sympathetic. Some coverage emphasized the absurdity of the more extreme regulations in a way that was comic rather than serious. The girdle requirement, the approved lipstick colours, the age cut-offs. The comedy was not entirely wrong. These requirements are genuinely absurd by most reasonable measures. But the comedy sometimes obscured the seriousness of what was actually at stake. The women who were being terminated for getting married were not experiencing a comic situation. The women who were developing disordered relationships with food in order to pass the quarterly weigh-ins were not experiencing a comedy. The stewardesses understood both and navigated the coverage accordingly. They were willing to allow the absurdity to be funny, because funny attracted attention, and attention was what they needed. But they kept returning, in interview after interview, in testimony after testimony, to the underlying question. The question that the humour could gesture toward but not fully answer. The question was, what does it mean to build a profession around the physical appearance and personal life choices of the people who hold the jobs? What does it say about those people, and what does it say about the culture that built it that way? These were not new questions. They were questions that women in many industries have been living with for a very long time, but the stewardess situation posed them with unusual clarity, because the rules were written down, and the consequences were documented, and the gap between the official justification and the actual reason was, if you looked carefully, not very wide at all. The cabin is very quiet now. The drink service ended hours ago, and the passengers are, most of them, in the particular state that is not quite sleep, but is not quite wakefulness either. The suspended state of long-distance flying, where time becomes strange and the body is not entirely sure what to do with itself. Someone has reclined so far that the passenger behind them has given up on using their tray table and is balancing their cup of water on their knee with practiced resignation. In the galley, the woman with the novel has finished her chapter and closed the book on her thumb and is looking at nothing in particular, thinking about the spring, about the ring, about the number that is currently in the file, that is currently within the required range, and about the two calculations she is running simultaneously that have no solution that satisfies all the variables at once. She hears a sound from the cabin. She puts the book down. She goes, "We have been talking about rules and regulations and legal proceedings and marketing campaigns. We have been talking about systems. But systems are made of people, and the people who made up the stewardess workforce of the 1960s and 70s were as varied as any large professional group. What united them was the job. What distinguished them was everything else. Let us talk about some of them. Patricia Grace joined Transworld Airlines in 1961. She was 22 years old from a small town in Ohio, and she had spent 2 years at a business college that had prepared her for a secretarial career that she was already quite certain she did not want. She saw an advertisement for stewardess positions in a magazine, on a page across from an advertisement for dishwasher detergent, and the juxtaposition struck her as significant enough to act on. She applied. She was selected. She flew for 9 years. In her memoir, written in the 1990s, she describes the weight requirements with a dry matter-of-factness that comes from having lived through them long enough that the emotion has flattened out into something more like historical fact. She was 5'4" and was required to weigh no more than 128 pounds. She weighed 128 pounds when she was hired, which she describes as requiring effort to maintain even then. Over the 9 years she flew, maintaining the number became progressively more effortful. She describes a period in her 7th year of flying when she was crash dieting before every quarterly check-in and recovering afterward with what she calls the enthusiastic eating of someone who has been holding their breath for 6 weeks. She describes the marriage question with a different quality of emotion, not the flat reportage of the weight requirements, but something more complicated. She did not get married while she was flying. She had relationships, serious ones, but she was aware in each of them of the specific mathematics involved. The man she was most seriously involved with, for 3 years in the mid-60s, wanted to get married. She wanted to keep flying. The relationship ended. She does not describe this with self-pity, but she does describe it with the clarity of someone who has understood, in retrospect, exactly what she was being asked to choose between. She flew until she was 31. She left the year before she would have been aged out. She became a customer service manager for the airline. Ground-based, no weight checks, no age cut-offs. She was very good at it. Maria Elena Rodriguez joined Braniff International Airways in 1965. Braniff was, in the mid-60s, doing something genuinely unusual in the aviation industry. They had hired the Italian designer Emilio Pucci to redesign their stewardess uniforms into something that made the fashion press take notice. The Braniff stewardesses wore Pucci designs in the saturated psychedelic colours that Pucci specialised in, tangerine and violet and electric blue, and the airline marketed this design collaboration extensively as an example of an airline that understood that the aesthetic experience was part of the product. Rodriguez, who had grown up in San Antonio and had studied fashion design for a year before deciding she wanted to travel, loved the Pucci uniforms. She describes them with a genuine enthusiasm that complicates any simple narrative about the uniform as a symbol of oppression. The uniform was a symbol of something more complicated than that. It was simultaneously a set of constraints and a professional identity, and, in the specific case of the Pucci designs, genuinely beautiful clothing that she would not otherwise have had access to. She flew for 6 years. She got married in her 5th year and hid it for several months, wearing her wedding ring only when off duty, keeping her married name off all professional documentation, asking her husband not to call her at work hotels in ways that might lead to questions. When the marriage was eventually discovered, her husband was recognised on a flight by a supervisor who had met him at a company event before the marriage. She was terminated immediately. She describes the termination with a clarity that is, if anything, more striking than anger. She had known it was coming. She had known the terms of the deal she'd made. She described sitting in the airline's regional offices in Dallas, being told that her employment was terminated effective immediately, and thinking that she was already calculating, even during the conversation, which of her colleagues she should call first to warn about the supervisor who had recognised her husband. The solidarity persisted past the employment. Dorothy Mae Jackson joined American Airlines in 1959, which made her one of the early cohort who flew into the jet age, the first women to work on the Boeing 707 in regular commercial service. She describes the entry into the 707 era with a wonder that is still palpable decades later in her recorded interviews. The size of the aircraft, the speed, the altitude, the first time she looked out a window at altitude and saw the curvature of the Earth, which she describes as the most beautiful and overwhelming thing she had ever seen. Jackson flew for 11 years, which was exceptional. She had joined young enough at 20 that she hit the age cutoff at 31, 1 year before the general 32 maximum at American. She describes the final months of her flying career with a grief that she contextualizes carefully. She knew other women who had gone through harder things, she says, and she does not want to present her own experience as representative of the worst of it. But 11 years is a long time to do something well, and she had done it well, and the cutoff came regardless of how well she had done it. After she left American, she became involved in the nascent stewardess rights movement. She testified before a congressional subcommittee in 1973 about the age requirements, and the testimony is archived and occasionally quoted in histories of the period. She was by then 32 years old, and she makes the point in her testimony with a precision that is clearly intentional. She is 32. She is sitting in front of them at 32. She would like them to look at her and tell her that she's too old to carry a tray. They did not tell her that. The range of experiences among stewardesses of the era extended to women who, genuinely, experienced the job primarily as freedom, and who, asked to reflect on the marriage ban or the weight requirements, offered a different kind of analysis than the one I have been presenting. Not a defense of the rules. Most of the women who flew during this period do not defend the rules, even the ones who found ways to work within them comfortably. But a more complicated accounting of what the rules meant within the full picture of the experience. Some of them argue that the rules were the price of admission to something that was genuinely extraordinary. That the world they got access to through the job, the literal world, the cities and the cultures and the people, was worth the weight checks and the marriage ban and the age cutoff, not because those things were acceptable. They are clear that they were not acceptable. But because the calculation for them came out positive. They got something real, and they paid a real price for it, and on reflection they would have paid the price again. This is not a comfortable position for a retrospective history to sit with. It would be tidier if all the stewardesses look back and see only the injustice, because the injustice was real and significant, and the tidiness of a simple narrative about oppression would be satisfying in the way that simple narratives always are. But the women themselves don't offer that, and they are the ones who are there, and their complexity deserves the same respect as the simpler story. Some of them argue something even more pointed, that the experience of navigating the rules, of developing the specific skills required to maintain professionalism under the conditions of constant evaluation, built in them something they have been using ever since. A particular kind of resilience, a particular knowledge of how to manage their presentation under conditions that were not of their choosing. A professional expertise in the management of other people's perceptions that has turned out to be, in the businesses and careers many of them built after flying, genuinely valuable. This is not a defense of the rules either. It is an acknowledgement that human beings are adaptive, that they make use of what they have, that the qualities required to survive an unfair system are sometimes qualities that also serve them well in fairer ones. The terminal late at night has gone very quiet. The departure boards are still cycling their information, but there are fewer people moving through the space, and the sound of the airport has dropped from the roar of the day to something more like a hum. A cleaner is moving through the far end of the terminal with a machine that buffs the floor, and the machine makes a low, even sound that is oddly soothing, the sound of a task being performed steadily and without drama. Near the window, a woman in civilian clothes is sitting in one of the plastic chairs with her shoes off and her feet tucked under her, looking at her phone. She's 34. She flew for American for 8 years as a flight attendant, because that is what they are called now, have been called since the 1970s, a name that describes the job in professional terms rather than the terms of a 1950s advertising campaign. She has just come off a 12-hour transatlantic and is waiting for her connecting flight home. She's not wearing approved lipstick, she is wearing whatever lipstick she felt like wearing. Her shoes, currently tucked under the chair, are whatever shoes she found comfortable for a 12-hour shift. She's not wearing a girdle. She got married 3 years ago. She is not thinking about her weight. She's thinking about whether there is a good place to get noodles near this terminal. The changes came slowly, and then all at once, and then slowly again. The story of how the stewardess rules were dismantled is not a story with a single triumphant moment, a courtroom, a ruling, a celebration. It is a story of accumulated pressure, legal proceedings and union negotiations and cultural shifts, and individual women refusing one at a time to accept specific conditions. It is a story that took approximately 30 years from the first challenges in the mid-1960s to the last weight requirements being substantially modified in the early 1990s. The sequence matters. The marriage ban was first. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's 1968 guidance was the beginning, and the airline-specific legal challenges that followed, each one adding to the legal record, each one making it harder for the remaining airlines to maintain the ban with legal confidence, meant that by the early 1970s the marriage ban was gone at most major carriers, and gone at all of them by the late 70s. The name change came around the same time. Not a legal change, a cultural one, though cultural changes often have practical effects as significant as legal ones. The shift from stewardess to flight attendant happened gradually across the 1970s, and different airlines adopted it at different speeds. But the direction was consistent. The new term was gender neutral. It could apply to men as well as women, which was becoming necessary as male cabin crew became more common. It described the job functionally, attending to passengers in flight, rather than in terms that carried the aesthetic and social baggage of stewardess. It was, in a small but real way, a name that described a profession rather than an image. The profession itself changed. The entry of men into cabin crew, which happened slowly across the 70s and more substantially in the 80s, changed the culture in ways that are complicated to summarize, because the experiences of the women who flew through the transition period varied considerably. Some found it immediately positive, a normalization of the job as a profession, a disruption of the marketing-driven image that had defined the stewardess era. Some found it complicated. The solidarity that had existed among the all-female cabin crews of the 60s was specific to that context, and the new mixed-gender crews had a different dynamic. The passengers changed too, or the passenger base changed. Deregulation of the American airline industry, which began with the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, dramatically increased competition among carriers and dramatically decreased fares. Flying, which had been relatively expensive and therefore relatively exclusive through most of the Golden Age, became genuinely affordable for a much wider segment of the population. The experience of flying changed with the passenger base, became less of an occasion and more of a transit, less a statement of status and more a means of getting from one place to another efficiently. The flight attendants who flew through this transition described it as disorienting in ways that were not entirely negative. The passengers who expected the Golden Age experience, the detailed service, the attention, the elaborate meals, the particular social register of a flight in 1965, became less common. The passengers who simply wanted to get somewhere became more common. The flight attendant's role shifted accordingly, becoming more operational and less performative. This was, on balance, probably better. The operational requirements were based on actual professional competence. The performative requirements had been based on something else. The age requirements disappeared from most carriers by the early 1980s, through a combination of legal challenge and the broader normalization of older workers in all professional contexts. The specific legal milestone was less clear-cut here than with the marriage ban. The age requirement cases were individually litigated and individually settled, and the record is more fragmented. But by 1985, a flight attendant who wanted to keep flying was not being shown the door because of a number that had nothing to do with her ability to do her job. The weight requirements, as mentioned, lasted the longest. They persisted in various forms and at various airlines into the early 1990s. The specific legal action that became the most visible was the class action suit against United Airlines, brought by a group of flight attendants who argued that the weight requirements as applied at United constituted both sex discrimination and disability discrimination, because the effective weight targets required many women to maintain weights that were, according to medical evidence, below healthy levels. The settlement in 1991 was a significant moment. United agreed to modify its weight standards substantially, adopting a table that was based on medical guidelines rather than aesthetic preferences. The new standards allowed for a range of weights that, unlike the old standards, corresponded to what medical consensus would actually describe as healthy for a woman of a given height. This was not nothing. This was, in fact, a great deal, because the old standards had been genuinely harmful to the women required to meet them, in ways that the medical evidence had made increasingly difficult to deny. But the settlement also illuminated how long the standards had operated before anyone had successfully challenged them on those grounds. The weight requirements that were substantially modified in 1991 had been in place, in essentially the same form since approximately 1940. 50 years, half a century of quarterly weigh-ins, half a century of women managing their relationship with food and their own bodies according to a set of numbers determined not by doctors but by airline executives who had decided, in a boardroom conversation in approximately 1945, what a stewardess was supposed to look like. The women who had flown under those requirements, and who were still alive and accessible to researchers and journalists in the 90s, had complicated reactions to the settlement. Not the simple vindication you might expect. Something more mixed. Some expressed genuine anger at how long it had taken, at the scale of the harm that 50 years of harmful weight requirements had produced, and that was now being acknowledged only because legal and financial pressure had made acknowledgement necessary. Some expressed a more complicated emotion, something that combined the anger with a recognition that their own experiences had been, in retrospect, part of a pattern that they had not always been able to see clearly while they were living inside it. The research that followed, the academic work and the journalism and the memoirs of the 90s and early 2000s that reconstructed the history of the stewardess era, painted a portrait of a workplace that is now, in most respects, clearly recognizable as discriminatory by any reasonable contemporary standard. The marriage ban, the age cutoffs, the weight requirements, the appearance supervisors checking compliance with girdle requirements. These things are now clearly on one side of a line, but the historians and the memoirists also grappled with the complexity that comes from doing history honestly. The stewardesses of the 60s were not victims in the complete and simple sense. They were agents, women who made choices, who built careers, who found freedom within constraints, who developed solidarity and professional expertise and a global worldview that was, genuinely, extraordinary. They were also subject to workplace conditions that were unjust. Both things were true simultaneously, and the best accounts of this history hold both things in view at once: the legacy of stewardesses for women's rights, and the broader movement that grew out of the stewardess situation extends beyond the specific regulations that were changed. The legal precedents established in the airline cases helped define what Title VII of the Civil Rights Act actually meant in practice, helped establish that customer preference for discrimination was not a valid legal defence, that the bona fide occupational qualification exception had genuine limits, that the regulation of employees' personal lives had limits that employment law would enforce. These precedents had effects in industries far beyond aviation. The argument that a company could not require female employees to be unmarried was an argument that companies in every sector had to take seriously after the airline cases established it. The argument that customer preference for a particular kind of woman did not justify requiring all female employees to fit that preference was an argument with applications wherever women worked in customer-facing roles, which was most of the places women worked at all. The changes to the flight attendant profession also became a case study in how occupational culture can change, not immediately and not without resistance, but genuinely and substantially. The profession that exists today, while still subject to various pressures and imperfections, is recognisably different from the one that existed in 1963. Flight attendants are hired on the basis of professional qualifications. They are not required to be unmarried. They are not aged out at 32. They are not weighed quarterly and warned and terminated if the number exceeds a target that had nothing to do with their professional competence. They are still, frequently exhausted. The scheduling of modern airline operations is grueling. The passengers are sometimes difficult. The galley is still narrow. The work is still physically demanding in ways that are not always recognised. The job has genuine challenges that the changes of the last 50 years did not resolve, because those challenges are inherent to the work rather than invented by a boardroom in 1945. But the women who do it now do it on different terms, and the terms matter. The terminal is quiet. The last few travellers are distributed across the seating areas in the random way of people who have claimed a space and are waiting for something. A man in a business suit is asleep sitting up, his head at an angle that will produce a remarkable neckache when he wakes. Two teenagers are watching something on a shared screen, their heads bent together, their laughter occasional and quiet. A woman at the gate is knitting, her needles making a small, steady sound that no one in the terminal is listening to, but that is there, gentle and persistent. The departure board changes. A gate number updates. In a few hours, an aircraft will push back from that gate and begin the long process of climbing into the dark, and aboard it, a flight attendant, a person in a uniform, a professional, will complete her safety briefing and help a child with their seatbelt, and answer the question about whether there is a vegetarian option, and manage the man in row 12 who wants to argue about the carry-on bag policy and all of the rest of it. She will be whatever age she is. She will be whatever weight she is. She will or will not be wearing a wedding ring. No one will check. There is a particular quality to the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning in an airport, when most of the flights have landed and the early departures have not yet begun, and the building is running at the lowest possible register of its ordinary self. The cleaning machines make their slow circuits. The occasional announcement breaks the silence, a gate change, a baggage claim notification. In the slightly unreal cadence of airport announcements, as if the voice belongs to someone who is reading from a script in another time zone. It is in these hours that airports reveal something of what they are when no one is looking, not what they are for, the commerce and the transit and the arrival and departure that is their entire reason for existence. What they are underneath that. The physical fact of them, the enormous spaces, the high ceilings, the light that is always slightly too even, the temperature that is always slightly too controlled, the sense of a place that exists outside the ordinary categories of interior and exterior, night and day, here and there. You have been here a while. You have been sitting with this story since the terminal was full, and the lights were bright and the departure board was cycling rapidly. You have watched the story change around you. The 60s giving way to the 70s, giving way to the 80s and the 90s, and eventually to the present, which has its own imperfections and its own injustices, but is genuinely different from 1963 in the specific ways that matter for the women who wear the uniform. There is something worth staying with in the quiet of this hour before the story entirely resolves. It is this. The regulations that governed the stewardesses of the 1960s were not unique to aviation. They were an expression, unusually explicit and unusually documented, of a set of assumptions about women and work and bodies and personhood that were present across the culture. The airline rule books made explicit what was implicit elsewhere, in the interview processes for secretarial positions, in the social expectations placed on nurses and teachers and department store workers, in the unwritten rules that governed how women were expected to appear and behave in professional contexts across almost every industry. Aviation made it explicit because aviation was building an image. The stewardess was a marketing tool as well as an employee, and the regulations that governed her were therefore written down with the specificity of a brand guideline. In most workplaces, the equivalent regulations were enforced informally, through the comments of supervisors, through the social pressure of colleagues, through the hiring decisions that passed over candidates, for reasons that were never articulated but were always understood. Aviation wrote it down, which in the end made it easier to challenge because you could put the document in front of a judge and say, "Here, this is what they are requiring. Read it." The stewardesses who fought the rules used that explicitness as a tool. The explicitness that had been a source of humiliation, the specific number on the scale, the specific age in the rulebook, the specific page that said a married woman would be terminated, became, in legal proceedings, the evidence. The airline's insistence on writing everything down was ultimately part of what undid them. There is a small irony in this that is worth noting in the quiet of the late-night airport. The discipline of documentation, the rule books, the compliance records, the weight monitoring files, was the discipline of control. It was designed to maintain the image that the airlines had constructed and to ensure that every stewardess fitted it. But the same discipline of documentation created the paper trail that the legal challenges needed to succeed. The rulebooks that had been issued to intimidate became, in time, the exhibits in the cases that dismantled the rules they contained. The women who flew during this period are now in their 80s or their 90s, or no longer here. The youngest of them, who entered the workforce in the early 1970s and experienced the tail end of the regulatory era before the changes took effect, are in their late 60s or 70s. The golden age of the stewardess, the specific cultural moment between 1958 and approximately 1975, when the image was at its most constructed and its most marketed and its most aggressively maintained, is beyond the living memory of most people who are currently in the workforce. But the history persists, the memoirs persist, the legal documents persist, the photographs persist, those rows of uniformed women at gate areas and aircraft steps, all at the same height and the same weight and the same age, and all smiling the regulated smile, all representing the image that someone in a boardroom had decided was worth building and maintaining at the cost that it cost. And the precedents persist. The legal framework that the stewardess cases helped establish is still operative. The principle that customer preference for discrimination does not justify the discrimination, established in part in the airline cases of the early 70s, is still the law. The principle that an employer cannot require female employees to be unmarried, established in part by the EEOC guidance and the subsequent airline cases, is still the law. The principle that the regulation of employees' personal lives has limits that employment law will enforce, still the law. These principles were not established easily or quickly. They were established by women who decided, one at a time and then in organized groups, that the specific conditions they were living under were not acceptable, that the rules were not inevitable, that the rulebooks could be argued with, in formal settings, by people who had learned the relevant legal language and were willing to use it. They were right. Not immediately. The process took 30 years, which is not immediate by any measure, but right. The aircraft at the gate is beginning the processes that precede boarding. Ground crew are moving around it with a purposeful efficiency that is slightly hypnotic to watch in the empty terminal. Fuel lines are being disconnected. Luggage is being loaded into the hold. The cabin is being cleaned. A brief, efficient process that has to be completed between flights at a speed that would have seemed impossible to the passengers who watched the stewardesses of the 60s maintain those immaculate cabins with what looked like unhurried grace. In the jetway, a flight attendant is waiting for the boarding process to begin. She has been flying for 15 years. She is 41. She's not thinking about her age. She's thinking about the weather report for the crossing, because there is weather in the mid-Atlantic that the captain has flagged, and that may require adjustments to the service schedule, and she's running through the timing in her head, working out what can be moved and what cannot. She's very good at her job. She's been doing it for 15 years, which is long enough to have developed the kind of professional expertise that only comes from sustained practice. The ability to read a cabin, to know which passenger is going to be a problem before they become one, to manage turbulence and difficult passengers and mechanical delays and all the rest of it, with the particular composure of someone who has encountered most situations before and has learned, specifically, how to handle them. She's 41. She is still here. This is the thing that the rulebooks of 1963 did not account for, and could not account for, because the rulebooks of 1963 were not written with the actual capabilities of actual women in mind. They were written with an image in mind, and the image had an expiration date, and the expiration date was 32, and at 32 the image was finished, the employment was terminated, the woman was sent back to whatever life she had put on hold to hold the image together for the duration of her allowable years. The actual women did not expire, they kept going. They took what they had learned in the air, about managing difficult situations, about maintaining composure under pressure, about the specific intelligence required to keep a confined space full of stressed strangers calm and safe, and they took it with them into the rest of their lives, into the businesses they built and the organizations they led, and the legal proceedings they brought, and the testimonies they gave and the memoirs they wrote so that the story could be told. Some of them are the grandmothers of women who are now flight attendants, who fly now on different terms under different rules, with different expectations of what the job requires and what the job cannot require. The grandmothers have stories. The grandmothers tell them, let the airport settle very gently around you. Let the cleaning machines make their slow circuit. Let the departure board cycle through its information. Let the flight attendant in the jetway run through her weather calculations. Let the night outside the enormous windows do what nights do. Hold the darkness for the few remaining hours before the light begins, far away at the eastern edge of the sky, to shift. The story is not over. Stories like this one are not over, not entirely. Not when there are still workplaces where the image matters more than the competence, where the body is still a professional metric, where the personal choices of employees are still subject to scrutiny they have not consented to. The specific rules may be gone. The underlying impulse that produced them is more persistent. But the tools for challenging it are there, in the legal record and the cultural memory and the example of the women who looked at the rule book and decided that it was worth arguing with. That the rules were not the last word. That 32 was not old. That a ring was not a resignation. They were right. And the proof of their rightness is present every time a 41-year-old flight attendant with 15 years of experience stands in a jetway and thinks about the weather report and knows, without any doubt, that she is exactly where she has earned the right to be. And now the terminal grows very quiet. The last story has been told. The last argument has been made. The last court case has been decided. The last rule book has been put away. Into the archive, into the historical record, into the specific kind of past that is not forgotten, but that is, at least finished. At least that specific iteration of it. You're still here, in the plastic chair, with the night outside the windows and the low hum of the building around you. You are warm, you are comfortable. The airport in its emptied state has become something almost peaceful. The enormous spaces that were chaotic this afternoon have a different quality at 4 a.m, a quality of simple bigness, of space existing for its own sake, without the urgency of the human traffic that fills it in the ordinary hours. Somewhere on the other side of the building a coffee shop is beginning to stir. Someone is making the first pot of the morning, and the smell of it is not yet reaching this part of the terminal, but it will. That is the next thing. The coffee, and then the light, and then the first passengers of the early morning, and the whole business of the day beginning again. But that is not yet. Right now there is just this, the departure board, cycling slowly through its information, the cleaning machine finishing its last circuit, the woman in the jetway who has finished her weather calculations and is now simply waiting, in the particular patience of a person who has learned to wait professionally. The dark outside the windows, the stars which have been there all along, in between the light pollution and the cloud cover, doing what they do without reference to any of this. The story you've been told tonight is a true one. The names in it, Ellen Church, who flew first. The women of Stewardesses for Women's Rights. The names on the legal cases. The women in the memoirs. They were real, and the things that happened to them were real, and the rules they lived under were real, and the changes they made were real. And the women who fly now are real too, flying their different routes, under their different rules, thinking about weather reports and passenger manifests and the vegetarian option, and all the small infinite details of a job that is still genuinely extraordinary in its demands and its rewards, still offering the world as it always did, still requiring stamina and professionalism and resilience, and the specific intelligence of someone who has to manage a small community of strangers in an enclosed space at speed, still, in its best moments, giving the people who do it something that is genuinely hard to find elsewhere, the experience of being genuinely needed, genuinely skilled, genuinely consequential in the small and daily way that is the most important kind. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Let the terminal fade a little at the edges, the cleaning machine's hum becoming more distant, the departure board cycling without urgency, the light evening out into something softer and more manageable. The woman in the galley has finished her novel. She has left it on the counter for whoever finds it, which is something that stewardesses used to do. Leave books on galleys and seats and in airport lounges, a quiet circulatory system of reading material moving through the routes. She does not know who left it before her. She does not know who will find it next. The aircraft is beginning its descent. Far below, a city is beginning the very earliest processes of waking. The bakeries, the hospitals, the airports themselves, the people whose lives run on earlier schedules than the rest. The sky to the east is not yet light, but it is no longer entirely dark. There is a word for this moment in the old astronomical language. Civil twilight. The time when the sun is just below the horizon, and there is enough light to see by, but not enough to be called day. The time between. In that time between, the aircraft descends. The passengers shift in their seats and gather themselves back from wherever sleep has taken them. The flight attendant makes a last check of the cabin, all belts fastened, all seats upright, all trays stowed, all well. She stands at the front of the aircraft and watches the runway lights come up through the forward window. She has done this hundreds of times. It has not stopped being beautiful. The wheels touch the ground, the engines reverse, the aircraft slows, to the pace of a car, then slower, then the gentle roll of a vehicle finding its gate. They are down, and the day begins. The male pilots who flew the earliest commercial routes in the 1920s were a specific type of person, shaped by a specific moment in history. They had come out of the First World War with a particular relationship to altitude and speed and mechanical failure, a relationship forged in combat, where the aircraft had been weapons rather than vehicles, where the machinery was understood to be unreliable and the sky understood to be hostile, and where the skill of staying alive was a skill refined under conditions that would have been impossible to replicate in peacetime training. These men, and they were, nearly without exception, men, brought their wartime aircraft skills into a post-war world that had no immediate use for them, and watched, with varying degrees of patience, as the commercial aviation industry slowly began to develop into something that might provide a living. The early mail runs were cold and loud and occasionally fatal. The aircraft were modified versions of military designs, not built for passengers but adapted for cargo, and the modifications that allowed them to carry mail were not the modifications that would have made them comfortable or safe for human passengers. The routes went where the post office needed them to go, which was not always where geography or weather logic suggested would be wise, and the pilots who flew them developed a kind of professional fatalism that was admired in the culture of the time, and that would look to a modern safety culture like an absence of concern about risk that should have been alarming. But the mail runs established something crucial: the infrastructure of commercial flight, the routes, the landing fields, rough and improvised in the beginning, but becoming over the course of the 1920s more substantial, more reliable, more like airports and less like cleared pastures, the navigational technology, the communication systems, and gradually the regulatory framework that would eventually make commercial aviation safe enough to sell to passengers. The passengers, when they came slowly. The first commercial passenger flights in the United States were operated by airlines that were, in the 1920s, tiny operations with single aircraft and single routes, and a passenger manifest that might, on a good day, include 4 or 5 names. The airlines competed for passengers in the way that new industries always compete, not primarily on quality, because the quality across the industry was similarly and uniformly rough, but on price and availability and the willingness to take you where you needed to go. The experience of being a passenger on a commercial aircraft in 1927 is worth describing, because the contrast with what came later illuminates the scale of the transformation. You would arrive at a landing field, not yet called an airport, in a vehicle that had brought you across country roads that were often unpaved, carrying your luggage in a bag that was considerably smaller than the bags modern passengers try to fit into overhead bins, because the aircraft had neither the space nor the structural allowance for significant cargo. You would be met by someone, probably the pilot or a ground crew member, who would take your ticket and direct you to the aircraft. The aircraft was small. Smaller than you expected if you had only seen photographs. You would sit in a seat that was wicker because wicker was light, and light was what the aircraft needed, and you would feel the specific cold of an unheated cabin at altitude, which was the cold of open air rather than the regulated cold of an air conditioning system. The noise was extraordinary. The engines were not muffled in the way that later engineering would muffle them, and the roar was not background noise but foreground noise, the primary sensory experience of the flight, something that made conversation impossible and thought difficult, and concentrated the mind, usefully, on the single fact of being airborne. The pilots were aware of their passengers in the way that people are aware of cargo they have been instructed to treat carefully. Not negligently. Most of the early commercial pilots were genuinely conscientious about passenger safety, understanding that the reputation of their small airlines depended on not losing passengers, which was an outcome that the industry, already struggling for credibility, could not afford. But the relationship between pilot and passenger in the 1920s was not the relationship that commercial aviation would eventually develop. It was the relationship of a skilled professional doing a difficult and risky job and of a paying customer who had agreed, by purchasing the ticket to accept a level of risk that most forms of transportation would not have required. The development of larger aircraft in the late 1920s and early 1930s changed the picture. The Ford Trimeter, the Tin Goose, as it was called with the affectionate contempt that engineers reserve for aircraft that are effective but ungainly, seated 12 passengers in something that was, by the standards of the time, almost comfortable. The Trimeter had a cabin that could be heated approximately. It had seats that were padded approximately. It had windows. It was loud and cold and prone to turbulence in ways that the air-smoothing technology of later generations would substantially reduce. But it was recognisably an aircraft designed for human beings, rather than adapted for them as an afterthought. The Boeing 247, which came in 1933, was the aircraft that established the template for commercial aviation. Twin engines, retractable landing gear, soundproofed and heated cabin, 10 passengers in seats that were actually comfortable, a cruising speed of 189 miles per hour. The 247 made transcontinental flight in 20 hours possible. Still an ordeal by later standards, but an ordeal that produced an arrival at the destination rather than a complete physical breakdown. The Douglas DC-3, which followed in 1936 and became the most significant commercial aircraft in the history of the industry, carried 21 passengers and flew them in a cabin that was genuinely consistently comfortable. Warm, reasonably quiet, with real seats and real windows and the whole experience of a service that had figured out what it was supposed to be. It was in this context, the DC-3 era, the mid-1930s through the 1940s, that the stewardess role developed into something recognisable. The aircraft were large enough to require cabin service. The routes were long enough that passengers needed management during flight. The passenger base was expanding, and the expanding passenger base included people who were not aviation enthusiasts, who were not flying for the thrill of it, or because they would fly anything for any reason, who were flying because it was the fastest way to get somewhere, and who needed to be convinced that the experience was worth the cost and worth the anxiety. The stewardess was the person who would do that convincing, not through argument or explanation, but through presence. The specific presence of a professional who was clearly at home in the aircraft, who moved through its narrow spaces with the comfort of someone for whom this was ordinary, who did not react to turbulence or engine noise or altitude with any visible anxiety, whose composure was the continuous visual demonstration that there was nothing here to be afraid of. Ellen Church had understood this when she wrote her letter to Boeing Air Transport in 1930. She had understood, as a nurse, the specific psychology of patients who were afraid, the way fear operates in the body, the way it amplifies sensation and creates anticipatory suffering and makes every small discomfort feel like evidence of impending catastrophe. She'd understood that the presence of a calm, competent authority figure could interrupt that cycle, not by eliminating the fear, but by providing a reference point for what the appropriate response to the situation actually was. The appropriate response was, "We are fine. This is normal. I do this every day and I'm not afraid, and because I'm not afraid you are able, for a few minutes at least, to borrow my not being afraid and use it as your own." It worked. It worked immediately, and it worked consistently, and it worked across every airline that adopted the practice, and it worked in ways that the airlines had not entirely anticipated, because they had not entirely anticipated the depth of the passenger anxiety they were addressing. They had expected the stewardesses to be useful. They had not expected them to be transformative, and then they had made the transformation permanent and built an industry around it, and spent the next 40 years defending regulations that had never been about the work at all. The aircraft that first carried Ellen Church in 1930 was a Boeing 80A. It was a biplane, 2 wings, one above the other, in the design that predated the monoplane technology that would supersede it within the decade. It carried 12 passengers and a crew of 2 pilots, and, from May of 1930, a stewardess. It flew between San Francisco and Cheyenne, Wyoming, which is not the route you would choose if you were designing a glamorous introduction to commercial aviation, but which was the route that existed and which the stewardesses flew because that was where the work was. The Boeing 80A is long gone. The last of them was scrapped in the 1940s, but the idea that Ellen Church flew into being on that first flight in May of 1930, the idea that the person who took care of passengers in the air was a professional, was trained, was skilled, was the most important human presence aboard other than the pilots. That idea persisted through every transformation that followed, even through the decades when the training was bent toward appearance rather than competence, when the regulations were more about weight than about first aid. Even through all of that, the fundamental idea persisted, that the passenger, frightened or not, needed someone to borrow composure from, and that the professional who provided it was worth having. The geography of stewardess hiring in the 1960s was not random. The airlines recruited at specific colleges, primarily the women's colleges and the business schools that trained women for professional careers that were not yet, in 1963, as varied as they would become. They attended career fairs. They ran advertisements in the college newspapers and in the women's magazines that reached the demographic they were looking for. Young women with some college education, with customer service experience, with a specific combination of professional ambition and social ease that the job required. The advertisements were themselves a product of the image-making apparatus that shaped the stewardess era. They did not say, "We are looking for a woman who is between 115 and 135 pounds and who will agree to be terminated upon marriage or upon reaching the age of 32. They said, "Travel the world. See Paris, Tokyo, London. A career with wings." The gap between the advertisement and the employment contract was significant, and while candidates were not deceived about the requirements were stated clearly enough in the application materials. The emphasis of the recruiting materials was always on the adventure rather than the constraints. The women who applied were not naive about this. Many of them had older sisters or friends who had flown or were flying, and the informal network of information among the stewardess community was dense and reasonably accurate. You knew, going in, about the weight checks. You knew about the marriage ban. You knew about the age cutoff. You knew in the way that young people always know things that apply to their future self, which is to say you knew it in the abstract in a way that did not feel quite real until it was right in front of you. What you could not know, going in, was the texture of the experience. You could not know what it actually felt like to be standing in a hotel room in Hong Kong at 2 a.m. after a 12-hour flight, looking at a city skyline that you had never seen before and that was genuinely extraordinary. You could not know the specific quality of the friendship that developed among women who flew together regularly, the conversations in the galley that happened nowhere else, about nothing important and about everything important simultaneously, in the way that conversations between people who trust each other happen when the constraints of ordinary social presentation have been loosened by fatigue and altitude and the particular intimacy of shared professional difficulty. You could not know the specific pride of doing a hard thing well, the pride of managing a genuine emergency, a medical event, a violent passenger, a serious mechanical problem, with the competence that your training had given you and that the situation had required. The pride of knowing, concretely and specifically, that the people on your aircraft were safer because you were there and were good at what you did. These were things that the advertisements had gestured toward with words like adventure and travel and career with wings, but that were different from those words in the way that the real thing is always different from the description of it. They were the reasons that many of the women who went through the weight checks and the girdle requirements and the quarterly weigh-ins and the marriage ban continued to choose the job, not because the conditions were acceptable, but because what the job gave them in return was also real. The interviews themselves, the formal selection events that followed the initial application review, were conducted at regional offices or at specially designated hiring venues, and they typically took a full day. The morning was usually devoted to group activities, presentations about the airline and the role, group exercises that allowed the interviewers to observe how the candidates interacted with each other and manage social situations, question and answer sessions that were partly informational and partly evaluative. The afternoon was for individual interviews, the one-on-one conversations, the physical assessments, the final decisions. The group activities were, by the accounts of women who went through them, a specific kind of social performance. You were being watched. You knew you were being watched. The other candidates knew they were being watched, and yet the situation required you to behave as if you were not being watched, to be naturally warm and professionally composed and genuinely interested in the other candidates, rather than presenting the appearance of interest while actually treating them as competitors. The candidates who made it through the group activities, according to the testimonies of the supervisors who conducted the events, were the ones who managed to be both things simultaneously, genuinely engaged with the people around them and professionally composed in their self-presentation. The ones who were only one or the other, genuinely warm but professionally rough around the edges, or professionally polished but visibly calculating, tended to be identified and set aside. This requirement, to be simultaneously genuine and professional, to be warmly authentic and carefully presented, to care about people and also to perform caring about people in the specific way that the airline needed, was perhaps the most demanding of all the things the job required. It was demanding not because it was impossible. Many of the women who were hired and who flew for years were genuinely capable of it, but it was demanding because it had no off switch. The professional warmth was required not for 8 hours, and then you go home and are whoever you actually are. It was required for the duration of the flight, which was sometimes 12 hours or 14 hours or longer, across time zones, at altitude, in the specific physical and cognitive conditions of long-distance flying. The training schools were, in part, an attempt to develop this capability in the candidates who had been selected, and they were, by most accounts, effective. Not in the sense of teaching warmth to people who had none, but in the sense of developing the professional version of warmth that could be sustained under the conditions the job would produce. The ability to be warm when you were tired, the ability to be patient with a difficult passenger when you had already been patient with 6 difficult passengers that flight, the ability to smile, genuinely if not entirely spontaneously, at the 47th passenger who asked whether the flight would be on time when the answer was the same as it had been for the 46 previous passengers. The physical training was rigorous in a different way, learning the specific choreography of galley work, which sequences of tasks could be done simultaneously, which required the full attention of both hands, how to balance a full tray in turbulence, how to work around a colleague in a space that was approximately 3 feet wide, learning the emergency procedures, the evacuation protocols, the use of emergency equipment, the specific decision trees for different categories of in-flight medical emergency, learning the door operations which are genuinely complex and which require both physical technique and calm under pressure, because the moments when you need to open the emergency doors are by definition not calm moments. The combination of the physical and the emotional training produced, in the women who completed it successfully, a specific kind of professional competence that was greater than either component alone. The technical skills were valuable, the emotional regulation skills were valuable. But the combination, the ability to deploy technical skills under emotional pressure, to manage a medical emergency while also managing the emotional climate of the cabin, to be simultaneously competent and reassuring, this combination was what made a flight attendant genuinely excellent at the job, and it was this combination that the training schools were at their best trying to develop. At their worst, the training schools were also trying to develop something else. The ability to maintain an acceptable appearance under all conditions, the weight monitoring during training, the appearance checks, the instruction in approved makeup application, the critique of hairstyles that were technically within the guidelines but aesthetically suboptimal. These elements sat alongside the legitimate professional training and were indistinguishable from it in the official curriculum. The same authority, the same seriousness, the same implication that both were equally necessary for professional competence. They were not equally necessary. The emergency evacuation training was a matter of life and death. The approved lipstick colour was a matter of brand identity. The conflation of the two, their treatment as equivalent requirements, equally important, equally enforceable, was part of what made the training schools, despite their genuine professional content, an expression of the broader problem with the stewardess role. You carry both things forward as you settle deeper into sleep, the competence and the constraint, the extraordinary gift of the work and the cost at which it was given. Let them both be true, because they were both true. Let the complexity be part of the story. Acti 4, Expansion. The rules in detail, additional approximately 3,200 words. There was a woman at American Airlines in the late 1960s whose specific job title, as far as anyone has been able to reconstruct it from the documentary record, was something like appearance coordinator. Her name does not appear in most histories. She was not a named party in any of the major legal proceedings, and she did not leave a memoir. But her function is described in the testimonies of stewardesses who flew for American during this period. She was the person who came through the terminal before a flight and checked the hair, checked the makeup, checked the uniform, checked reportedly whether the stewardesses were wearing the required foundational garments. She did this with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a professional doing a routine job, and the stewardesses who described her in their testimonies did so with a range of emotions: anger, resignation, dark humour, the specific embarrassment of being assessed for your adequacy by another person in a professional context, that reflects the range of ways this kind of oversight could feel. The stewardess who described her most vividly said that the appearance coordinator had a specific look that she deployed when something was wrong. Not a word, not an exclamation or an expression of disapproval, just a look, a specific combination of expression that communicated, "This is not acceptable, you need to fix it, you know what I mean." The stewardess who described this said that the look was more effective than any verbal instruction would have been, because it communicated not just the specific deficiency, but the broader principle. You are being watched, and what you look like matters, and the watching is continuous. This is the experience of being an image rather than a person, not the experience of being criticized once or twice, which is part of any professional life. The experience of being continuously assessed against a standard that has nothing to do with your work and everything to do with your body and face and the specific angles at which your hair falls and the exact shade of the lipstick you have applied this morning. The experience of knowing that the assessment is always happening, that there is no part of your working day in which you are simply a professional doing her job without her appearance being part of the evaluation. The psychological literature on constant monitoring of this kind describes its effects with some consistency. Constant monitoring produces a specific kind of cognitive load, the load of maintaining self-monitoring alongside the monitoring of the environment. It divides attention. It produces anxiety that is not acute but chronic. Background anxiety that runs below the level of conscious awareness but shapes behavior and shapes the experience of the workplace in ways that are cumulative. People who are constantly monitored develop over time a relationship with the monitoring that is either adaptive. They internalize the standards to the point where they no longer experience the monitoring as external. It becomes part of how they see themselves, or resistant. They develop strategies for managing the monitoring that distance them from it, that create a private space behind the professional performance. The stewardesses who described their experiences to researchers and journalists in the 90s and 2000s showed both patterns. Some described having internalized the weight requirements and the appearance standards to the point where they were, at the time, genuinely their own standards. They wanted to be at the required weight. They were proud of meeting the appearance requirements. The monitoring was an external confirmation of what they had already accepted as the appropriate criteria for their professional self-assessment. This is not a pathological response. It is a normal human adaptation to the requirements of one's environment. But it is also an adaptation that carries costs that sometimes became visible only after the environment changed, and the women discovered what their relationship with their own bodies actually was when no one was weighing them quarterly. Others described having developed a clear internal distinction between the professional self, the self that met the requirements, passed the checks, maintained the approved appearance, and the private self, which had its own criteria and its own values and its own relationship with its own body that the airline's requirements had no access to. These women described the monitoring as something external and removable, like a uniform. You put it on for work and took it off when work was over. This was a psychologically healthier adaptation, though it required a kind of ongoing effort to maintain the distinction, to keep reminding yourself that the number on the scale was a work requirement, rather than a truth about your worth. The food culture that developed among stewardesses around the weight requirements was its own specific phenomenon. The crash dieting before quarterly weigh-ins, the specific strategies for managing weight while travelling internationally, which is genuinely difficult because travel disrupts the routines that weight management depends on, and because international routes created access to foods that were not part of the usual diet, and that were, in the context of the layovers, part of the pleasure and reward of the job. The layover in Paris was less of an adventure if you could not eat the food. The management of this tension between the weight requirement and the genuine pleasures of the travelling life that the job offered produced an eating culture that was, by the accounts of many former stewardesses, disordered in ways that were not recognised as such at the time. The term disordered eating was not widely used in 1965, and the specific eating behaviours that it describes, the restriction and the binge, the strategic deprivation and the compensatory excess, the relationship with food organised primarily around a number rather than around hunger, or pleasure or nourishment, were not clearly recognised as a clinical pattern. They were recognised within the stewardess community as strategies, practical responses to a practical problem. The problem being, how do you maintain a weight that requires constant vigilance while living a life that is specifically organised around movement and novelty and disruption of routine? The answer was, not easily and not without cost. The cost was sometimes immediately visible. The health effects of chronic caloric restriction in physically demanding work are well documented and include fatigue, cognitive impairment, weakened immune response, and bone density loss. all of which have obvious implications for someone doing a job that required sustained physical and cognitive performance over long shifts at altitude. Some of the cost became visible only later, in the years after the flying ended, and the weight requirement disappeared, and the body was left to find its own equilibrium after years of managed restriction. These are the costs that were not in the rulebook. The rulebook specified the requirement. It did not specify the means by which the requirement was to be met, which meant that the means were worked out individually, in private, in the specific circumstances of each woman's life, without any professional oversight or medical guidance or acknowledgement that what was being required might be harmful. The rules were extensive, the rules were maintained, and the cost of maintaining them was paid, one quarterly weigh-in at a time, by the women for whom the rulebook had been written. Let that settle gently in the dark. Let the weight of it be acknowledged, and then, because acknowledgement is not the same as dwelling, set it down. The advertising campaigns of the 1960s produced imagery that has entered. Let the morning settle in. Let the first light find you wherever you are. Let the history of these women, their specific lives in their specific circumstances, their professional competence and their legal courage, and their daily management of conditions that were unjust, and their genuine love of the work that the conditions were attached to. Let all of it rest now, in the early light, in the quiet that follows a long story when the story has been told. The aircraft are already in the air. They have been in the air all night, crossing and recrossing the dark, carrying their cargoes of sleeping and waking people toward destinations that will become, when they arrive, the next beginning. The flight attendants aboard them are working. They are doing their jobs, as they have been doing their jobs since Ellen Church walked into a San Francisco office in 1930 and said, "I have an idea." The idea persisted. The profession persisted. The women persisted. And somewhere up ahead, the sky is opening into morning. Let yourself go there. Let the story carry you gently all the way down. Sleep well. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Did you know about the marriage ban and age cutoffs before watching this? And if you had been a woman in the 1960s, knowing the rules, would you have taken the job anyway? Let me know in the comments.